Not just a place on the map, but a state of perpetual dying. Here, winter is not a season, but a pathological state of reality. The sun, as if frightened by something ancient and unspeakably alien, abandons these lands for long months, leaving them to rot in crimson twilight and a bottomless, coal-black darkness that is not merely an absence of light, but something alive, dense and breathing. It was here on the Prometheus oil rig, lost in an icy void where even the radio signal from the mainland arrived as a distorted whisper, that Marcus worked. He was hired for huge money, which he now regretted with every cell of his tormented body. The seasonal affective disorder he had battled with varying success all his life here, in this eternal night, bloomed into a lush, poisonous flower of madness. The world had shrunk to the size of a metal cabin reeking of machine oil and fear, the roar of machinery like the death rattle of a giant beast, and the all-pervading cold that didn't just creep under the skin, it dug into the bones. The brain, the soul, freezing him from the inside out. The depression wasn't just sadness. It was a physical weight, a sensation that his body was slowly turning to stone and his consciousness was drowning in tar. But the worst were the shadows. Not the ones cast by objects, but others, moving at the very edge of vision, sliding in the periphery like spiders. Whispers in the ventilation that formed his name. Distinct footsteps in the absolutely empty corridor that fell silent the moment he dared to look out. The doctor on the mainland, after listening to him on the satellite phone, prescribed new pills and advised more light. As if light could save him from what waited in the dark. Light. It became his obsession, his religion, his only anchor in a reality growing more precarious by the day. At his disposal was a powerful spotlight installed on his section for night work. Marcus kept it on always, even when unnecessary, burning precious fuel. The blinding white beam, like a lightsaber, fiercely and helplessly sliced through the darkness, hitting an endless, impenetrable wall of night. It created a small island of safety around Marcus, a patch of illusory reality where one could still breathe without feeling the darkness pour into the lungs with the air. Marcus worked, ate, sometimes just stood under its rays, feeling them burn his retinas, searing away the creeping horror that clung to his heels, and whispered something soundless in a language that shouldn't exist. It was under this spotlight, his personal sun in hell, that it began. Quietly, insignificantly, like a seed of cancer. That evening, he was checking the frozen valves. His movements were slowed by chemical fatigue from the pills and the heaviness in his soul. Raising his hand to wipe his fogged glasses, he caught a discrepancy out of the corner of his eye, a tiny glitch in the matrix of being. His shadow on the frost, unnaturally sharp, black, like an abyss into nothingness, a hole in the fabric of the world, moved a fraction of a second before he did. Not in parallel, but before. He froze, his hand hanging in the air. His heart skipped a beat, stalled, then hammered with such fury that black dots danced in his temples. An eye glitch. He immediately tried to convince himself, swallowing a sticky, salty lump of panic. Fatigue, a hallucination, side effects. But the rationalizations turned to dust as soon as they were born. He deliberately repeated the movement, slowly, smoothly lowering his hand, watching the shadow with painful concentration. And again, the shadow reacted instantly, as if anticipating him, as if it were the puppeteer and he merely the marionette. It was a tiny, almost invisible lead, but it was enough for an icy trickle of animal, primal fear to pierce him through, from the crown of his head to his heels, locking his muscles. Marcus tried to ignore it. He returned to his cabin, took a double dose of sleeping pills, and fell into a heavy, unconscious sleep from which his own scream tore him. He dreamed he was standing under the spotlight, and his shadow, detached, came close to him and, having no face, watched him. And in that facelessness was a greater horror than in any monstrous visage. The next day it repeated, and the next. The shadow began to live its own life. It didn't just mimic his movements, it anticipated them, was their cause, not their effect. When he wanted to step, the shadow had already stepped. When he turned his head, the shadow was already looking that way, sometimes passing shiny surfaces. He saw his reflection linger, continuing to watch him with a cold, alien curiosity. The climax came on the evening when, exhausted, he leaned against an icy metal beam, trying to light a cigarette. His hands shook so badly, he couldn't catch the flame of the lighter. He stood motionless, staring into the darkness beyond his circle of salvational light, into the very darkness that now seemed to watch him with millions of invisible eyes. And then he saw it. His shadow, cast by the spotlight onto the snow, was still until he himself moved. It turned its head, slowly, with a faint crunching sound, as if vertebrae of ice were breaking. It looked around, studying the terrain he himself hadn't yet surveyed, its movement smooth, deliberate, intelligent. And only when the freezing terror peaked and Marcus, unable to bear it, convulsively jerked away, did the shadow smoothly, effortlessly, return to its rightful position, merging with his contour. But for a moment he thought its hand touched his heel, an icy, lifeless touch of void. After that, Marcus stopped sleeping. He turned on all the lights in his cabin, but they were dim, pathetic compared to his spotlight, and their light seemed dirty, sick. He went outside and stood under it for hours, like a moth flying into the flame that was about to kill it. He knew he was going insane, but this knowledge no longer brought relief, because madness was now the only explanation. He called his superiors, begged, sobbed into the receiver, demanding a helicopter, but due to a snowstorm that, like an evil fate, refused to abate, the evacuation was postponed indefinitely. His voice broke into a hysterical scream, but in response, he heard only calm, reasonable, so distant words. "Hang in there, Marcus. The storm will end soon." They didn't understand. The storm wasn't outside. The storm was inside him. He started keeping a video diary. Perhaps evidence of his madness would help him later, on the mainland, to prove that he hadn't cracked from mere loneliness, but from something real. Something that lived in this darkness and fed on the light of the human soul. The camera became his confessor, his only interlocutor. He recorded his paranoid monologues, his trembling hands, the empty corridors of the rig, on which he sometimes, upon review, noticed a dark spot quickly slipping around a corner. And then, that night arrived. The one. The storm raged with a special, almost personified fury. The wind howled with 1,000 voices, trying to tear the rig from its foundation, to drag it into oblivion. Marcus stood under the spotlight. He could fight no more. Fatigue was knocking him off his feet. His mind was strained to the limit. He looked at his shadow, which today was unnaturally sharp, black and thick, like liquid asphalt, despite the raging blizzard. It didn't sway in the wind. It was absolutely static and waiting. He turned on the camera mounted on a tripod. His face on the screen was gray, haggard, his eyes sunk into dark, bruise-like hollows, and stared out from there from the depths with the silent horror of the doomed. "It's especially active today," he whispered, his voice hoarse and alien. "It's looking at me. I feel its gaze. Not the reflections, but it hates the light. Hates me for forcing it to be tied to me. It wants to leave, and I'm almost not stopping it." He fell silent, freezing, staring into the space before him, but seeing something beyond it. The recording shows his shadow on the wall behind him beginning to pulsate like a black heart of a monster. It grows thicker, denser, acquiring an unhealthy, oily sheen. And then, while Marcus himself stands, paralyzed with horror, unable to move a muscle, his shadow detaches from him. It wasn't a sharp jerk. It was a slow, agonizing process of peeling away, as if tearing off a piece of living flesh, a part of his own soul. The shadow tore away from his heels, pulling behind it a black, viscous, stringy substance resembling crude oil, and straightened up. It was his exact but flat, soulless copy, a void that had taken human form. It turned its faceless head towards Marcus, who stood with his mouth open in a silent scream, and lingered for a moment, as if saying goodbye, or appraising what it was leaving behind, and then it walked. Not left, but walked. Slowly, dragging its feet, with a terrifying, unnatural creak that was audible even over the howling wind, away from the spotlight into the embrace of the raging, living darkness. It took a few steps, and the darkness, as if having long awaited its child, absorbed it, soaked it up without a trace. The camera recorded for a few more minutes. Marcus still stood motionless, his face frozen in a mask of absolute, all-consuming terror, behind which there was nothing left. Then he slowly, very slowly, with difficulty, as if his limbs were made of cast iron, raised his head and looked directly into the lens. His eyes held no madness, no panic, not even despair, only emptiness, the same absolute cosmic emptiness that had walked into the night. He was a shell, a crypt. It got lost, he whispered quietly, almost soundlessly, and his voice held not a trace of human emotion. I'm alone now. It's so dark here. He took a step forward beyond the circle of light to where his shadow had just dissolved, and the darkness, like a predator, pounced on him and swallowed him without a trace. The rescuers who found the camera a week later never found Marcus's body. The recording held only his frozen face and the departing shadow. The official report stated, mental breakdown caused by extreme isolation. Presumed suicide. Psychiatrists wrote dissertations on hallucinations induced by the polar night. But the old workers in Alaska, those who had spent more than one winter in the dark and whose eyes had seen things not spoken of in civilized circles, know a different truth. They whisper around campfires that on the darkest nights one must beware not only of the cold polar bears and loneliness. One must beware one's own shadow, to watch it from the corner of the eye when no one is looking. Because sometimes the darkness is not just an absence of light. Sometimes it's something ancient, living, and hungry. And it watches you from within, from the very depths, and it has its own incomprehensible plans. And it can simply leave, leaving you an empty, cold shell, frozen under a bright, useless, mocking light, in an eternal wait for the day it might return, or bring others with it.